Hello everyone and welcome to the From a Writer's Perspective podcast, in which we will dissect the stories that influence us, analyze how they're created, and explore more about the writers behind them. I'm Khyrian Storms, and with me is my dear friend and aspiring writer, E.D. Leonard. For this episode, we're taking a look at the process behind one of fantasy's most influential writers, George R. R. Martin. And since the release of his fifth book, A Dance with Dragons, a lot of new projects have seen the light of day. With the recent release of the Elden Rings, a trailer for House of Dragons, not to mention 8 seasons of a monolithically successful series by the same name, there's still no follow-up to his last book. And Leonard, we both noticed in our writer's process, we've also experienced a lot of delays and setbacks. So if we're looking back at all the interviews of Martin and paralleling this to our own journey, I think we can gain some insights that will help other storytellers to refrain from making the same mistakes. So are there any insights that you have already? Are there some thoughts that you have yourself?
Well, the thing I'm asking myself is it a mistake or is it a way of working?
I think that's a very interesting take, because the way I look at it is, if you plan to write a book and then it takes you 11 years to write it, I don't know if it's a mistake, but I think definitely with the show running for that long and so many other projects in the work and so much demand for the story, at some point I do think that there are lessons to be learned from how to minimize that delay. I don't know if mistake's the right word.
No, but I see what you mean. I think, first of all, he didn't expect the HBO series to be such a success. And I think he also planned to have the series finished before the end of the TV series. And I think that's what, I don't know if it demotivated him, but yeah, I think that's one of the reasons it's taking so long.
I think there's a lot of, if you look back at interviews, and there's a lot of interviews, like you have one of The Insider, The Guardian, you have one with Stephen King. I think there's a lot of interviews that we went through where we did find that he himself is also disappointed that it's taken so long. He's even disappointed that the series has gone so fast. And I think he's also a type of writer that doesn't help him with finishing things very, very, very quickly and being very, very structured in certain ways of working. And he's also very highly critical. So I think there's a lot of points there where you could find parallels to even like a beginning writer. And these are the same things that I think every writer goes through in a certain degree. I think that even fame and being so successful, it doesn't become a psychologist to help you deal with your inner demons or your inner weaknesses.
No, I think it might even grow worse as there are more people waiting on your story. And like you said, I don't make predictions anymore because some asshole on the internet will take that as a promise.
Yeah, that was on his own blog, right?
Yeah.
They will basically crucify him.
Yeah, but I think that's the advantage we have as beginning or aspiring, well, published writers, because we write, so aspiring writers is always this weird term, because if you put words on a screen or on paper, then you're a writer, I think.
Exactly.
But yeah, we're an aspiring published writer. Yeah, I think we have the advantage to just create a world and nobody's waiting for it. But I think one of the things we both experienced as well, we're both on the other side of the spectrum, is the working with an outline.
Oh yeah.
I think that's the first thing he shot himself in the foot with, and I'm more on his side.
Yeah.
That just go with the flow and see whatever comes to mind and write it down. Whilst you're on the other side of the spectrum that just your outline is the story.
Well, I agree partly with it, but yeah, go on.
If you look at his story, having 5 books of, well, let's say about 800 pages, well, then it becomes very hard to edit it if you don't work with an outline and you just keep branching off each time you introduce a new character. And because each time you introduce a new character, you have to resolve it in some way. And you cannot introduce a character which and then just never mention it again, unless it's a side character. But he has a lot of main characters in the story, and they all need a satisfying ending.
Yeah, I think that this reference back to he had this perspective of it in a Guardian interview. He said like there's two types of writers, a guardian and an architect. And an architect basically knows the whole plan of the building way before he even goes to start building the building. You know, and a gardener, they basically dig a hole, drop in seeds, and they water it. And you know what the thing you said is that if you have a lot of characters, that is a lot of seeds that you have to water. And at some point, there's going to be a moment where you're going to be afraid, like, hey, did I forget to water a certain seed? Did I take the full extent? You know, and also, how much do I water this? Like, I mean, everyone that has a lot of plants in their house knows how hard it is to keep them alive. So the same happens, I think, with stories. If you have a lot of locations, a lot of lore, you have a lot of things that you need to be consistent in, they will create boundaries. And I think that not having an outline, and I think this is a good thing because what you're saying, you're definitely very much a gardener. I'm very much an architect. Like even preparing these episodes, I write down so much. And I think that what you just said is that the longer and the more lore-rich a story becomes, maybe it's that short stories you can definitely do as a gardener. But once you get into like a trilogy or even like a big series, you kind of have to work as an architect to some degree in the spectrum, or like shift more towards that part of the spectrum. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, and that's in the beginning when I started writing, I was more like screw the outline, just write and see whatever comes, what ends up on the paper. But I have to agree that when you're planning, maybe a trilogy or even more books, then you're gonna need an outline. And that's why I started, since I don't like using an outline, I started writing short stories. And in a short story, you can just freehand and see whatever ends up on the paper. But if you're planning for a bigger series, then yeah, I think you should definitely use an outline because, well, let's take our first story, for example. We just had this idea, have these two characters which represented us, and they go on an adventure. But we started the story with their father coming back from I don't even know, it was a battle or
from the war. They finished the war, and that it was after the war they basically went back home.
Yeah. And well, we kind of freehanded it in the beginning. So at a certain point, he walks through a forest and he finds this whistle, which it was just filler. We didn't mean anything with it. It was just, wow, this is cool, but I don't know if we're gonna do something with it.
I tend to think that if you freehand and you're a gardener, there's less control over what becomes filler and what not. You don't know that per se from the beginning, which is could be a good thing, could be a bad thing.
Yeah, but that whistle brought a whole new story to life, and I think the same thing happens with George R.R. Martin, where he's like, all right, I'll create the Starks and the Lannisters and do a retelling of the War of the Roses with the York and Lancaster. But I think the journalist in you will probably disagree because I have no evidence for this. But I think he just started with these two families, and then at a certain point he had this whistle like Theon Greyjoy, which at a certain point was captured in another battle.
Yeah.
And then started going from there. Like what's the culture he was from, and creating the Iron Islands, I believe they're called.
Exactly. And the curiosity takes over there, I guess, which is not bad. I think it's a great detour because it's a very interesting part of the world. But it is a detour that you have to create a satisfying ending to, or like you have to bring it back to the road. Like it's the same as you said a while ago. And I always remembered that quote. You said to me, like, it doesn't matter if you stray from your path as long as you get back to it. And I like that quote because that quote itself, it's very much a Theon Greyjoy. At some point, like the way he writes, he takes detours to explore parts of the rich lore that he wants to create. However, then you have to get back at some point to an ending where roads actually cross again.
Yeah, and for let's take Theon Greyjoy for example. He then creates even more detours around Theon Greyjoy. So Ramsay Bolton comes in, and in the books it's also what's he called? The king, King Robert's brother.
Stannis Baratheon.
Stannis, yeah. And it all happens in the north. So he has these side stories, which create side stories, and that's what he said. Like you drop a seed in, but you're never gonna know how many branches it's gonna get. And yeah, there's a lot of branches he created that all need a satisfying ending.
And I think you see a parallel to this, like not only in our stories, but you see this also a lot in story-focused open world games. So for instance, Cyberpunk, Red Dead Redemption, and it's very hard to do well. And I think Red Dead Redemption did it very well. And I think that, for instance, with Cyberpunk, what you really see, Cyberpunk 2077 by the creators of The Witcher, the main story itself, in my eyes, is not the most rewarding part of the game. There's just so much that makes it a very interesting game. However, the main story, therefore, like at some point, and I know you're a completionist, if you're a completionist, this will distract you so much from the main story that you at some point get so sidetracked that you forget what the actual story is about. Like, what is the thing you're presenting us? What is the cohesive narrative that you're trying to present? And I think that is also something that the main story in Game of Thrones, arguably, winter is coming. You know, the Starks and the Lannisters, they have their battles and they have their issues, and there's a revenge story. And I think the big main story is that everyone is so distracted with their petty like issues and revenge stories and those kind of things. And meanwhile, they're forgetting the enemy is coming. I mean, it's the same as, for instance, Don't Look Up, right? Where everyone is so busy trying to figure out if they can mine this asteroid or whether it's true or not, that in the end they're just too late with actually figuring it out.
Yeah, I think that's a parallel you can see, but I don't know if the main story is the most interesting. It's just these families, all these families fighting for the Iron Throne. Mm-hmm. You've got the White Walkers; those are the ice. And the dragons are fire. But it's all these intrapersonal things from the characters that are in my opinion, the most important and most interesting.
It's also a very interesting storytelling mechanic, because what you're basically doing is you create a conflict, and then you're looking at car crashes waiting to happen. You're waiting on the moment of impact. And to kind of extend beyond the world of Ice and Fire, there's also an insider article, Elio and Linda, who co-wrote the world of Ice and Fire, where they mentioned there's just so many things that came with the success of the books and the series that took a hold of his time. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of projects. I mean, we've mentioned in the introduction, the Elden Rings. There's this whole game, recreated the lore, I think 3 to 4 years ago. There's prequels. Well, he's also got things like Tales of Dunk and Egg, Who Fears Death. He has a Broadway play that he's working on. He's in Lost Land, Wild Cards, Roadmarks. These are all stories that he's trying to create as he's creating this and trying to finalize this world of Ice and Fire. Why do you think he takes on so many projects?
Well, I don't know about the Elden Ring or the Broadway musical or any of that, but yeah, I'm easily distracted as well, and also easily bored. If that's the right word, I don't know if it's the right word for it.
I mean, we even had this with our process as well. We want to write a trilogy. We find this trilogy to get out of hand, and we just don't know how to do it anymore, and we become infatuated with the hunter from the whistle, which at some point becomes like a hunter that actually goes into the story. And then all of a sudden we really wonder, like, okay, but we have like this whole war that happened before it, and a lot of characters that are going to become important later in like our own story. So why don't we invest into finding out why Argom needs to be in there? And from Argom, we get to a point where this almost becomes a 90 chapter book. because there's just so many characters that spawn from that. And then we're like, okay, you know what? Scratch that. This is going too much. Maybe we need to start simpler. Something that's completely like set like away from this whole story that does have to do with the war, and we get to Henricht. And Henricht is like another part of the world. And I remember that moment when we thought about that. You were like, okay, let's just write about a captain in the war, going from A to B, having a big battle, and then going back. And even that story became a pretty big story that we almost finished, but we didn't, because at some point we couldn't agree on the direction anymore. I think that also has to do a little bit with writing with two people, but it's also just very, very easy to at some point just go from, okay, this story is becoming too much of a mountain to pass, so we need hills.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. I think that's the same with George R. R. Martin. He's creating all these little side stories that take place in his world, but are not the main focus. And I have to admit, I haven't read Blood and Fire or the Dunk and Egg stories, so I don't know if they are taking place in or have some relation to the main story. I don't know if you know this.
I don't even know if the Tales of Dunk and Egg are even released. I think that the only thing that has been released in the meanwhile is Blood and Fire.
Yeah, I think there are a few volumes of the Dunk and Egg stories.
Okay.
And I think a first one has been released, and there will be more. There are more to come, or something like that.
But what you see with Blood and Fire is from Blood and Fire comes the House of Dragons. And that itself becomes a commitment as well. And he's got 4 other TV series with HBO in the works.
Yeah, and that's also a thing the show demotivated him, I think. It's this weird dynamic that he does these things like the shows which he loves and hates, but which also demotivates him to finish the Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah, I also think this happens due to the public a little bit. I think it's also like we are just as much to fault. Just even like us making a podcast, like, why are you taking so long, George R. R. Martin? Write for us, George R. R. Martin. Go dance for us. Like people getting mad because he doesn't finish anything. There's nothing sadder than that. There's moments where he has like great days. There's like 5 to 6 pages. There's sometimes also that he has like half a page. Sometimes he even hates these 5 to 6 pages and just deletes it. Do you edit while writing?
I used to, but I don't do it anymore. But that's also because I'm writing short stories. Mm-hmm. Then it's just all right. I'll just write it down, and I will later see which things I can keep and which I can throw out and which things I can replace and yeah, all these things. And even while editing, I'm getting more ideas, and now I'm translating the final or the final version of my first short story that I want to publish. And even in my translation, I'm still tweaking all these little things. Yeah, which slow the process.
First question I was wondering, when I edit while I write, I usually get to like a half a page or 1 page a day. It's very hard to get to the 3. How much is it that, because I know you can churn out a lot more work.
Yeah, that depends on how I've got the story in my mind. Like the first short story was something I'd been thinking about for a really long time. But then the second one came and I just wanted to write a story, but I didn't even have a story. So we just brainstormed a little bit, like what are the elements? Yeah, I just started writing and just see where it goes. The third one, yeah, I think I've written 4 short stories, which are about 20 pages each. So that's about 80 pages of different stories.
How long did it take to write all the short stories?
Probably a few months. I think the third and the fourth one were 2 or 3 months. I just had this basic idea and just started writing.
And do you need to be zen? Do you need to be in the moment then? when you write?
I usually stare at the page for a very long time and just slowly type, and at a certain point it will just click, and then maybe I can write 2-3 pages. Also 5 or 6 is very, very hard for me as well. But yeah, sometimes you have good moments, sometimes you don't. It's hard to say.
I think there's also, and we'll put these things in the show notes and reference to it, but I know that there's also an interview somewhere out there where Martin says that, some writers, they need to be extremely zen. They need to just completely be focused. They need to have their coffee. They need to have like everything. They have their ritual. And some writers, like for instance, Stephen King, he consistently has the time to write. And he sits down, and he churns out 6 pages, and that's it.
Always wanted to ask me.
Yes, there is something I want to ask you.
All right.
How do you write so many books so fast? I think, I've had a really good 6 months. I've written 3 chapters, and you've finished 3 books in that time.
Here's the thing, okay? There are books and there are books. The way that I work, I try to get out there and I try to get 6 pages a day. So with a book like End of Watch, and when I'm working, I work every day, 3-4 hours, and I try to get those 6 pages and I try to get them fairly clean. So if the manuscript is, let's say, 360 pages long, that's basically 2 months' work. It's concentrated, but but that's assuming that it goes well.
And you do hit 6 pages a day?
I usually do.
You don't ever have a day where you sit down there and it's like constipation and you write a sentence and you hate the sentence and you check your email and you wonder if you had any talent after all, and maybe you should have been a plumber.
And I don't think that has to do with like being a gardener or an architect, because I know that Stephen King, I believe he's also very much a gardener that has like a base idea of what he wants to write.
Yeah, and he always has the same setting. It's always some rural town in Maine.
There's not much lore building around the environment itself, I guess.
Yeah, and that also depends, because I think, well, he's got this whole turtle world idea or something.
It also comes back in the Dark Tower, I think, even, right?
Yeah, but if you look at it, that's not something he just made up and was like, all right, just I'll see where it goes. I think he really thought it through.
Looking at Stephen King and looking at George R. R. Martin, I think that George R. R. Martin is, and I'm going to say something here that maybe I'm going to regret, but I think he is less disciplined in a certain type of way. If you look at, like, for instance, Stephen King, and also with that comes that George R. R. Martin is more indulgent. I think Stephen King in itself is also less indulgent a type of person.
Yeah, I think, well, the thing we can agree on is that he writes slow, and if you look at his process, just taking on other projects, I would be like, why are you doing this? I mean, he doesn't have to do it for the money. And if you look at Elden Ring is a Soulsborne game. It's from the same developers as the Soulsborne games, I believe. They don't need George R. R. Martin to promote their world. It's just a hordes of fans who like Soulsborne game, and I don't actually see what George R. R. Martin can add to the world.
What I think is the problem with those stories as well is that because they're so tedious, you get distracted easily just by the challenge of it, that it's very hard to piece together the story and lore.
Yeah, but I think the fans of these series like to just pick up every item or read each small lore tab and just piece the story together. I don't think you need George R. R. Martin for that.
What I could also imagine, and this goes a very far off topic, so I think we can... What I think is that also, if you look at these Soulsborne kind of games, at some point there's so many of these type of games. You have Sakura, Shadows Die Twice, you have you have all. So at some point there's going to be a moment where you need to push the genre forward, and I do think that Sakura, for instance, it kind of put in this layer of these type of games, this new level of evolution, where you kind of do need this lore. maybe that's something that's happening, because I also think that you can't endlessly just bring out Tekken games. You can't endlessly bring out Super Mario games. You have to, at some point, come with a paper Super Mario. You have to come with, like, Mario Kart. You have to diversify. You can't always build on the same thing. So I do understand that they themselves want to bring in a great writer to focus more on that part. I can imagine George R. Martin being, hey, this is an interesting new way of, like, writing a story and think. I also, like, I'm never gonna play it. I've seen the trailer and I kind of see where the George R. Martin influences come from. But hey, either way, that's about Elden Ring.
But I have to admit that if I had a successful series just as a writer and I'm finishing a book and I don't know, Nintendo would come to me and like, well, would you like to help on the next Zelda game? That I might be tempted as well to just say, you know what, this book can wait. Let's do this. But that's because I'm a fan of the series, and well, Elden Ring is a first, so it's not that he's a big fan. I think of the series because it's a big name because George R. R. Martin works on it.
Of course, it's a new IP. I also think this comes back to the first thing you mentioned is, in how much is this all a mistake? We look at how much output he gives us and how many projects come out from like his mind. It's still an incredible time to be alive if you're a George R. R. Martin fan. But it's just not that one book. It's not finishing up that story.
But are people George R. R. Martin fans, or are they A Song of Ice and Fire fans?
Yeah, and I think that is a big point where there's a lot of writers that, due to their health, haven't been able to finish that story. Herbert, like his son, at some point finished it up. I believe Robert Jordan as well, right?
Not his son, but another writer finished it. Yeah. Comparing him to Robert Jordan, Robert Jordan was a writer that had a very elaborate notebook of all things that just needed to happen. So yeah, Robert Jordan was the architect, and Brandon Sanderson only had to fill in the details. But the story was exactly pinpointed at which point something needed to happen. And yeah, well, for George R. R. Martin not working with any notes, well, just good luck if someone else need to finish his story.
Yeah, and I think that it's good that he, in the process of everything, he brought in like people like an Elio and Linda to like co-write the World of Ice and Fire. And I think it's also good that there's like he does now have people that kind of like archive things for him, but it's still like the same as the showrunners from Game of Thrones, D&D. Like these two, at some point, they knew all the information, but they didn't stick to it. Ended it in a way that demotivated Martin to follow up with his own, because that's also a thing. He said that the show did demotivate him in a certain way.
I published the fifth book in 2011 when the series was just going on the air, so I was like 5 books ahead. I was completely confident that I would have the entire series finished, and Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring would be out before they got to them. It was a blow when the series caught up. I didn't think it would happen.
You know, that also, like, he's very, very critical of his own work. The show demotivated of him. Like, he has a lot of things distracting him. So there's just... I think, you know, that might be another takeaway for a writer, because we're doing this podcast as well, and I fully know that I'm not the best writer to churn out a lot of work. So this is also going to be something that gets in the way of me finishing short stories. If you know that you're a gardener, if you know that you're someone that's easily distracted, if you know that, like, for instance, me, I know I have ADHD, should I put so many projects in my life that I need to finish?
Yeah, and do you need to write long stories or series? If you're a gardener, then my advice would be just write short stories and use that way to build your world.
And even if you're an architect, try to pull yourself, because that's something that I think for myself even. For me, being an architect, it helps to sometimes put myself more into the part of the spectrum that's for the gardeners. To sometimes just dig a hole, drop a seed, and then just water it.
One thing I'm wondering, which would be very nice if he did it, but I doubt it. But he said he had some, I don't know if it's 1,500 or 3,000 pages of manuscript. That's really a lot. He has written 3,000 pages of manuscript. Well, let's say a certain percentage gets cut out, but then you really keep a lot.
Yeah. Some things might be lore for the world of Fire and Ice. Some things might actually be written eventually for the prequel books. So but there's a lot of pages there.
What if he's just like, you know what? I'm just going to finish Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring at the same time. I'll just take in the critique that's coming towards me now, and I'll just do my thing. I'll take my time, but I'll finish both books, and well, not bring them out together, but have a few years between them, but just have it finished already. Just finish the whole project, and just wait for the right time to release them. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, it's always a possibility, but what I really think is happening is that you always think that you have more time than you do. You always think, okay, I'm going to write 3 pages tomorrow. I'm just going to consistently try to write at least every day. But then life happens. And I think it's just, you're either someone that has the character where you let life happen, or you create time to become a writer. I think I'm seeing too much of myself in here, but I let life happen way too much. And that's how I sometimes just can't get to the actual writing part. And I think if I look at everything he's doing and I think about how much time a person has in a day, because we all have an X amount of time in a day, there's a lot of things coming from him. And I think he has a lot of things that he's writing, but I think a bulk of that writing has been done in the beginning of the 2011 to 2022, which it is now. And I think lately he's just been focusing on a lot of other things. But hey, who knows?
Yeah, but still, it's really, really hard to grasp, because just think about 3,000 pages. Even in all of our time we have written, we didn't write 3,000 pages. So that's really a lot.
The question is, what are these pages? Because we did write about 2,000 pages. They're just not story. If you're looking at what we wrote in 7 years, we had, like, of course, the Argom story, the youth story, and we had Henrik's story. Those are maybe already 800 pages, maybe?
Nah.
In all its iterations? Iterations? There's multiple versions of the story. And we have lore pages. How many lore pages do we have? We have a lot of files, a lot of lore. We have a lot of outlines of like 20 pages sometimes even.
No, but I think it's specifically 3,000 pages of manuscript.
I wonder though. I don't know. Is there?
Martin believes the last 2 volumes of the series will total over 3,000 manuscript pages.
Will, so he doesn't even have them. He says he will eventually have.
Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, then I've read it wrong.
That's the thing. If you have that, then it just becomes a part of editing. And I know that editing sucks, but at some point you just get into the editing mode and you just do it.
And editing is the most boring part of the whole process. So maybe he's finished the first draft of his story, but is just struggling.
Could you imagine him just sitting on incredible work for 5 years already? Like those 3,000 pages, but just he doesn't want to edit it. And then at some point he's just like, oh, I hate it now at this point. I'll just delete everything. Because I mean, that's what even Tolkien at some point, like, deleted all his work, like a whole like chapter, and just rewrote it. Like, writers are prone to do that.
Yeah, but we now live in a digital age. I think it's harder to just delete everything than just start anew. But that's my take on it. I don't know if it's... Maybe he did. Maybe he was like, well, Control-Alt-Delete. And
if I can, because I think we've covered all the research that we did. I think we covered all the parts that I think we already talked about that we think are the reasons why he might be taking a little longer. If you would conclude for yourself what the actual issue is and what people can take away from this.
I think he just branched off too many times. That's one thing. And if you're a slow writer, then that's I think not having any progress, and that's usually what editing is. You can finish a story and then go back to edit it. When you're starting editing, you're not making any progress anymore, because this is how the story ends, and well, now I just need to write it in a nice way.
There's basically less dopamine involved in the editing of a story. It becomes tedious work that asks a lot of discipline.
Yeah, you're like, but I finished the story. Why would I even continue editing it? Because I already know how it ends. And that's the most fun part of writing a story, is creating it. And then editing it is the most boring part. At least that's how I feel.
And as a person that doesn't want to write outlines, would you say, if you tackle such a big story, that writing an outline would definitely help in becoming more of an architect?
Even then, we wrote outlines for a trilogy. And when we came to the second part, we also branched off a lot of times.
Yeah.
So you constantly have to update your outline as well.
Or you get to the actual point of the outline, you figure out that certain things just don't work.
Yeah.
There was literally one location that we couldn't get past. The outline wouldn't allow us to get past that point, because either you or me would always be, and usually you would be like, this makes no sense. At this point, the story stops making sense to me. I know that was also, like, for me, a big part in the writing process, where it's like, here we go again.
Yeah, and that's also the part where we decided to scrap the story and just, okay, this is the setting we're writing the story in now, but what happened before it? What happened in this long war the father returned from? We didn't know. We were just like, all right, this is a setting. Before all of this, there was a big war, but how it shaped the world, we didn't know. So that was a perfect opportunity to write these new stories. And we aimed to write a short story. Well, let's say 200 to 300 pages, a few stories of 200 to 300 pages, and have different perspectives, have one from the enemy side, one from the protagonist side. But yeah, in the end, it all didn't work out.
I think it's also about discipline and knowing when to say no to a project, which is learning how to say no is a great technique to, like, a skill to have for everything you're doing. Mm-hmm. And I also think, and that's a big part where we focused a little bit on it, but being very critical about yourself and editing while you're working and being very critical and not enjoying that process, it will make every day very tedious. So try to make the process itself a lot of fun for yourself as well. So yeah, I think that's basically episode 1.
All right.
Do you want to introduce what we're going to talk about the next time?
Well, I think that's more your topic.
Well, for our second episode of this year, we're going to look into Star Wars. We're going to look at where inspiration comes from, whether something can be seen as paying a homage, or whether something can actually be seen as copying an idea. And why are we mentioning Star Wars? Well, as some people might know, Star Wars has borrowed a lot of ideas from, for instance, Dune, and even Akira Kurosawa. And while George Lucas has been very honest about his love for the Japanese filmmaker, there have been some issues in the past with the way that he's taken ideas from Frank Herbert and the story of Dune. What we're gonna look at is, when are you paying homage? When are you copying an idea? And this is gonna be a very interesting topic to discuss, especially because even Wim Gibson, when he went to the cinema and saw Blade Runner, he looked at his own story, Neuromancer, and thought, everyone's gonna think I'm a fraud. And this is something that happens to a lot of young starting writers. So it's definitely something that I would love to discuss for you, E.D. Leonard.
Yeah, well, I have nothing more to add to that, so let's wrap it up.